November 1914. Sergeant André Maginot lay in a field hospital near Verdun, staring at his shattered leg. The bullet had torn through muscle and bone, leaving damage that would never fully heal. He would walk with a limp for the rest of his life, each step a reminder of the war that was devouring France. Around him, the wounded filled every bed, every corridor. Outside, the guns never stopped. For 4 years, German armies had trampled French soil, turning entire provinces into graveyards. By war's end, 1.4 million French soldiers would be dead. Entire towns would cease to exist. The industrial heartland of Alsace and Lorraine would be shattered. Maginot survived, but France itself barely did. As he recovered, one thought consumed him. This could never happen again. 15 years later, Maginot stood before the French Chamber of Deputies as Minister of War. His limp was still pronounced. His determination was absolute. He requested 3.3 billion francs to build the most formidable defensive system the world had ever seen. A continuous line of fortifications stretching 280 miles from Switzerland to Luxembourg. Concrete bunkers with walls 6 feet thick. Underground railways connecting fortress to fortress. Retractable gun turrets that could deliver devastating firepower. Air conditioning, hospitals, kitchens, even movie theatres for the garrison. Everything needed to make invasion impossible. The deputies voted 274 to 26 in favour. Construction began in 1930. By 1936, the Maginot Line was essentially complete. It had consumed 11 years of labour and cost roughly $9 billion in today's dollars. 1.5 million cubic metres of concrete. 150,000 tons of steel. 45 main fortresses, each capable of housing up to 1,000 men. 97 smaller forts. 352 casemates. 5,000 blockhouses. More than 100 kilometres of underground tunnels linking them all together. Winston Churchill toured the fortifications in August 1939 and declared them impenetrable. 9 months later, German tanks rolled through Belgium and entered France near Sedan. The Maginot Line remained intact, its guns silent, its garrisons trapped in concrete, while the battle raged elsewhere. By June 1940, France had surrendered. The greatest defensive system ever built had failed without being tested. This is the story of the Maginot Line, a monument to the last war, a fortress built with enormous care against an attack that never came, an engineering marvel that became synonymous with strategic blindness. France built it to prevent invasion. Instead, it taught the world that yesterday's solution cannot stop tomorrow's war. The trauma of World War I shaped every decision France made in the 1920s. The numbers were staggering. 6 million French casualties from a population of 40 million. 27,000 square miles of French territory destroyed. Industrial regions reduced to moonscapes. The birth rate had collapsed during the war, creating what French planners called the Hollow Years. By the mid-1930s, France would face a catastrophic shortage of military-age men. The generation that should have been entering conscription age simply didn't exist in sufficient numbers. Meanwhile, Germany's population stood at 70 million and growing. The demographic math was terrifying. In any future war, France would be badly outnumbered. Static defences offered a solution. Fortifications required fewer men to operate than mobile field armies. A properly designed defensive line could free up French divisions for offensive operations, while holding the border with minimal forces. The idea wasn't new. France had built the Serre de Rivière system after the defeat of 1870, a ring of forts around the eastern frontier. Those fortifications had performed well during World War I, particularly at Verdun. The debate over how to design the new defences consumed French military leadership through the mid-1920s. Marshal Joseph Joffre advocated for a system of dispersed strongpoints with mobile forces operating between them. Marshal Philippe Pétain, the hero of Verdun, pushed for a continuous fortified line covering the entire frontier. Both men had commanded millions during the war. Both had watched France nearly collapse. Their disagreement was fundamental. Joffre believed in flexibility and manoeuvre. Pétain believed in concrete and steel. The compromise satisfied neither completely. The Maginot Line would be continuous, but it would also feature massive fortresses with intervals of lighter defences between them. The strongest sections would protect the industrial regions of Metz, Lotha, and Alsace. Other sectors would receive only basic fortifications. Limited budgets forced choices. Not every kilometre could receive the same level of protection. In September 1927, the Commission d'Organisation des Régions Fortifiées was established to oversee design and construction, CORF, brought together military engineers, artillery specialists and fortification experts. They studied everything: the ring of forts at Verdun, the Belgian fortresses at Liège, the Czechoslovak border defences then under construction. They learned that dispersed gun positions survived better than concentrated ones, that underground facilities protected garrisons from bombardment, that interlocking fields of fire multiplied defensive effectiveness. The designs incorporated all these lessons. CORF created a system where multiple fortifications could support each other. Artillery from one fort could cover approaches to the next. If attackers penetrated between strongpoints, they would find themselves under fire from multiple directions. The defensive depth extended 25 kilometers from the border to the rear areas, 3 distinct layers, forward observation posts right on the frontier, combat fortifications with heavy weapons, rear support facilities for supply and reinforcement. André Maginot became the political champion of the project. His war wound had never properly healed. He walked with crutches by the late 1920s, the damage to his leg worsening with time. But his will was unbroken. As Minister of War in 1929, he appeared before Parliament to request the massive appropriation needed to begin construction. His speech combined practical military necessity with emotional appeal. France had suffered too much to remain vulnerable. The Treaty of Versailles provided no real security. Britain and America had refused to guarantee French borders. Germany's military restrictions under Versailles wouldn't last forever. Already there were signs of rearmament. When the next war came, and everyone believed it would come, France needed to be ready. The deputies were convinced. The appropriation passed overwhelmingly. Construction could begin in earnest. Maginot toured the early construction sites in October 1930, expressing satisfaction with the progress. He pushed, especially hard for robust defences in Lorraine, the region of his childhood, the place where he had been wounded. He would not live to see the line completed. Typhoid fever killed him in January 1932 after eating contaminated oysters. He was 54 years old. Only after his death did the defensive system officially adopt his name. Construction of the Maginot Line was an engineering undertaking without modern parallel. At peak activity, tens of thousands of workers laboured simultaneously across dozens of sites. The logistics were staggering. Cement had to be delivered by rail car. Steel reinforcement bars in quantities sufficient to build 5 Richelieu-class battleships. Specialised equipment for excavating deep underground. The work was dangerous. Cave-ins killed labourers. Accidents with machinery and explosives were common. But the Great Depression had left millions unemployed. Work on the fortifications provided steady wages and a sense of national purpose. The largest structures were the ouvrages, fortified complexes that served as the line's backbone. Each ouvrage consisted of multiple combat blocks connected by underground tunnels. The blocks were positioned on hilltops or elevated ground to provide maximum fields of fire. Combat blocks housed the heavy weapons, gun turrets with 75 Demier or 130 artillery, machine gun positions, observation posts with armoured cloches. Each block was a miniature fortress, protected by meters of reinforced concrete and interlocking steel. Beneath the combat blocks lay the heart of each ouvrage: barracks for the garrison, kitchens capable of feeding hundreds, medical facilities including operating rooms and dental chairs, ammunition magazines storing thousands of shells, power plants with diesel generators, water treatment systems and storage tanks, ventilation equipment that could maintain air pressure higher than outside, preventing gas attacks from penetrating, communication centres, with telephone lines running through armoured conduits. All of it located 30 metres underground, safe from any bombardment. The largest ouvrages, like Hackenberg and Schönenburg, contained more than 10 kilometres of tunnels. Electric trains ran on narrow-gauge tracks, shuttling personnel and ammunition between sections. A soldier assigned to one of these fortresses could spend months underground without seeing daylight. The garrisons consisted of specialised troops. Fortress infantry manned the lighter weapons and conducted patrols outside. Artillery crews operated the heavy guns, maintaining complex hydraulic systems that raised turrets for firing and retracted them for protection. Engineers kept the mechanical systems functioning. Communication specialists maintained the telephone network that linked every position. These men trained at a special facility near Bitchy, the only place where live-fire exercises were possible without endangering civilian areas. The combat blocks themselves were marvels of military engineering. The retractable turrets were particularly impressive. In their retracted position, The turrets sat flush with the concrete, presenting no target. When the garrison received orders to fire, hydraulic rams raised the turrets several meters. The gun crew traversed to their target, fired and retracted. The entire cycle took less than 2 minutes. The turrets were armoured with steel 250 mm thick, proof against all known artillery. Even a direct hit from a 200 mm shell would only dent the surface. The observation posts used armoured cloches, dome-shaped structures with vision slits. From these positions, observers could direct artillery fire with precision. The cloches were designed to deflect shells rather than stop them through pure thickness. Angles mattered more than mass. Between the major ouvrages stood smaller fortifications, petits ouvrages with garrisons of 100 to 200 men, casemates housing 12 to 60 soldiers, blockhouses scattered across the landscape, thousands of them positioned to create interlocking fields of fire. An attacker advancing between the major fortresses would find himself under fire from multiple directions, unable to concentrate his forces safely. The surface defences were equally formidable. Anti-tank obstacles covered likely avenues of approach, steel rails embedded vertically in concrete, check hedgehogs, 3 steel beams welded together at angles, dragon's teeth, rows of pyramidal concrete blocks designed to stop tank tracks, ditches too wide for vehicles to cross, minefields covering the intervals between fortifications. Behind the beaches where Normandy would be invaded in 1944, the Germans laid 3,700 obstacles. The Maginot Line employed similar principles on a vastly larger scale. The fortifications were designed to channel attackers into kill zones. If German forces tried to advance between strongpoints, they would have to navigate through obstacles while under fire from multiple directions. The entire system was coordinated. Koch had created not just a line of forts, but an integrated defensive network. Life inside the Maginot Line's major fortresses was unlike anything soldiers had experienced before. The comparison most frequently used was submarines. Like submariners, Maginot Line troops lived in artificial environments, sealed away from the outside world. Unlike submarines, they lived in relative comfort. The barracks were stark but functional. Soldiers slept in metal bunk beds, stacked 3 high in rows, 24 men to a room. Privacy was non-existent. The air smelled of concrete, diesel fuel, and hundreds of bodies living in close quarters. Temperatures remained constant year-round, around 53 degrees Fahrenheit. The ventilation system ran continuously, maintaining positive air pressure throughout the facility. Filters removed dust and chemical agents. If the Germans used poison gas, as they had in World War I, the fortress garrisons would be safe. The men wore regular uniforms modified slightly for underground service. No helmets were necessary 30 meters below ground. They developed a distinctive pale complexion, their skin never seeing sunlight for months at a time. To combat vitamin D deficiency, each garrison included rooms with ultraviolet lamps. Soldiers spent time under the lamps on rotation, artificial sunlight for artificial days. The kitchens were fully electric, modern by 1930s standards. Large pots could feed hundreds. The French army being the French army, wine was rationed at a quarter-litre per man per meal. Water came from deep wells, treated and stored in massive tanks. The menus were institutional but adequate. Fresh food came from supply convoys while the fortress remained connected to the rear. Once combat began, garrisons would rely on stored provisions. Each ouvrage stockpiled enough food to sustain its garrison for 3 months of siege. Medical facilities rivaled civilian hospitals. Operating rooms with proper surgical equipment, X-ray machines for diagnosing fractures, dental chairs where fortress dentists could extract teeth or fill cavities. The assumption was that wounded soldiers would remain inside the fortress, recovering in underground infirmaries. Evacuation under fire might be impossible. The forts had to be self-sufficient. Some fortresses included recreation facilities, reading rooms with books and magazines, areas where soldiers could write letters home, movie projectors and films, entertainment for men who might not leave the complex for half a year. The walls displayed murals painted by soldiers. Some showed pastoral scenes, forests and villages. Others showed patriotic imagery or simple decorations. One famous mural at Simserhof depicted Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs, anything to break the monotony of concrete tunnels. The command post in each fortress served as the nerve centre. Here, the commanding officer and his staff coordinated the garrison's actions. Telephone lines connected to every combat block, radio equipment for communicating with higher headquarters, maps covered the walls, showing sectors of responsibility and overlapping fields of fire with neighbouring fortifications. Messages arrived by pneumatic tube from other sections of the complex. In combat, this room would direct the fortress's response to attacks. The garrison's relationship with the outside world was carefully controlled. Soldiers rotated through assignments, 3 months inside the fortress, then leave to the rear barracks, then back underground. This prevented psychological breakdown from extended isolation. Mail arrived regularly during peacetime, delivered by train to the rear entrances. Families could visit during peacetime, though they were not allowed into the combat sections. The fortresses had 2 entrances, usually separated by several hundred meters. The rear entrance, called the munitions entrance, received supplies. Trains carrying ammunition, food, fuel and equipment arrived here. The forward entrance, the personnel entrance, was for soldiers coming on and off duty. Both entrances were heavily fortified with steel doors, guard posts and defensive positions. If attackers somehow penetrated one entrance, interior doors and secondary defences would seal them off from the deeper sections. The most impressive aspect of life in the Eurasias was the machinery. Diesel generators provided all electrical power, massive engines running continuously. When one engine required maintenance, others took the load. Power distribution systems fed electricity to the entire complex. Lighting, ventilation, water pumps, ammunition hoists, turret hydraulics, electric trains, communication equipment. The engineering staff constantly monitored gauges and indicators, maintaining the systems that kept 800 men alive in an artificial environment. The trains themselves were marvels. Small, electric locomotives pulled carts along narrow-gauge tracks. Some sections had stations with platforms where soldiers could board. Other tunnels were simply passageways where the trains shuttled supplies. The tracks connected the rear entrance to the forward combat blocks, a distance that could exceed 2 kilometers. Walking that distance while carrying ammunition was impractical. The trains made the fortress logistically viable. The fatal flaw in the Maginot Line was not engineering but geography. The fortifications ended at the Belgian border. This was not an oversight. It was a deliberate political decision with strategic consequences no one fully appreciated. Belgium had been France's ally since 1920. The two nations had signed a mutual defence treaty. French war plans assumed that if Germany attacked, French forces would advance into Belgium to meet the threat. Building the Maginot Line along the Belgian border would have signalled that France intended to abandon Belgium to its fate. The Belgians made this clear. They opposed any fortifications that suggested France would remain behind fixed defences, while Belgium fought alone. French politicians agreed. The alliance with Belgium was too important to jeopardise. So the Maginot Line stopped at Longwy, where the French, Belgian and Luxembourg borders met. From there to the English Channel, France's northern frontier remained largely unfortified. This created a gap roughly 250 kilometres wide. The French General Staff believed they had addressed this weakness. General Maurice Gamelin, the French commander, developed the Dial Plan. When Germany attacked, French and British forces would rush into Belgium, establishing a defensive line along the Dial River. This line would connect with the northern end of the Maginot Line, creating a continuous front from Switzerland to the sea. The plan assumed several things. That Belgium would request Allied assistance immediately, when Germany invaded. That French forces could move into Belgium and establish defensive positions before German forces arrived in strength. That the main German attack would come through central Belgium, the same route they had used in 1914. That the Ardennes forest, with its rough terrain and narrow roads, would prevent large-scale armoured operations. Every one of these assumptions would prove catastrophically wrong. The Ardennes became the ghost in French planning. This heavily forested region covering southern Belgium and northern Luxembourg seemed impassable to modern armies. The roads were narrow, the valleys were steep, forests limited visibility and mobility. French military doctrine, shaped by World War I experience, held that tanks required good roads and open terrain. The Ardennes offered neither. General Gamelin stated explicitly that if the Germans attacked through the Ardennes, it would take them so long to emerge that French forces would have time to redeploy and counterattack. The sector was therefore assigned to second-rate divisions, Category B formations made up of older reservists with limited training. The best French divisions were concentrated farther north, positioned to execute the Dial Plan. The Maginot Line itself held roughly one-third of the French army, 36 divisions manning fortifications along the German border. These were good troops in powerful positions, but they were essentially immobile. Once deployed in their fortresses, they could not easily redeploy to meet threats elsewhere. The extension of the Maginot Line along the Belgian border was discussed repeatedly through the 1930s. In 1936, Belgium declared neutrality, abrogating its alliance with France. This should have triggered immediate construction of fortifications along the entire northern frontier. Instead, France built only light defences, a thin extension of the main line. These fortifications lacked the depth and firepower of the main system. Many were simply concrete casemates with limited fields of fire. The reason was partly financial. The Great Depression had devastated French finances. The main Maginot Line had consumed enormous resources. Extending it properly would have required billions more, but cost alone doesn't explain the decision. French strategy fundamentally assumed that the next war would be fought in Belgium, not in France. The Maginot Line was designed to protect French territory, particularly the industrial regions of Alsace and Lorraine. The northern frontier was meant to be a highway for French armies advancing to meet the enemy. Building fortifications there would have complicated French offensive plans. Britain shared this strategic assumption. The British Expeditionary Force, when it deployed to France in September 1939, took positions along the Belgian border. British and French staff officers coordinated plans for the advance into Belgium. Both nations prepared for a replay of 1914, a massive collision in Belgium with the front eventually stabilising into trench warfare. Both expected months or years of attritional combat. Neither anticipated what was actually coming. The German General Staff was studying all of this carefully. They knew where the Maginot Line was strong and where it was weak. They knew about the Dial Plan. They knew French forces would rush into Belgium. And they were designing an operation that would exploit every weakness in French thinking. The plan wasn't initially accepted. When first proposed by Erich von Manstein in late 1939, many German generals considered it too risky. But Hitler for once made the right strategic decision. He approved Manstein's plan. The main German thrust would go through the Ardennes, emerging at Sedan at the weak northern end of the Maginot Line. Secondary attacks through Belgium would draw French forces north. Then the armoured spearhead would race for the English Channel, cutting the Allied armies in half. It was brilliant, and it was aimed precisely at the gap in French defences. May 10, 1940. At dawn, German forces crossed the borders of Holland, Belgium and Luxembourg. The attack everyone had anticipated had finally begun. The response was exactly what the Germans expected. The Dial Plan went into effect. The British Expeditionary Force and the best French divisions began moving into Belgium. Traffic jammed the roads as columns of trucks, tanks and artillery raced north. The plan was working. French forces reached their designated positions along the Dial River and began digging in. They expected the main German attack to hit them within days. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the Ardennes. German armoured columns were threading through the forest, moving faster than French intelligence believed possible. Panzer divisions commanded by Heinz Guderian, Erwin Rommel and Hermann Hoth advanced along narrow roads in single file. The columns stretched for miles, vulnerable to air attack if anyone had thought to look. But Allied air power was concentrated in Belgium, supporting the forces executing the Dial Plan. The Ardennes was considered a backwater. By the evening of May 12th, Guderian's panzers reached Sedan. The town sat on the east bank of the Meuse River, right at the northern end of the Maginot Line. The fortifications here were the light extensions, not the main system. The garrison consisted of General Lafontaine's 55th Infantry Division, a Category B formation. Older men, limited training, inadequate equipment. They had been told this was a quiet sector. The morning of May 13th, the German assault began. The Luftwaffe unleashed a concentrated bombing campaign unlike anything yet seen in the war. Stuka dive bombers attacked in waves, targeting French positions along the Meuse. The psychological effect was devastating. The screaming sirens of the Stukas, the constant explosions, the absence of French air support. French soldiers began abandoning their positions. Some fled south. Others simply stopped fighting, paralysed by terror. By late afternoon, German engineers were building pontoon bridges across the Meuse. The crossing succeeded with minimal casualties. By midnight, 3 Panzer divisions were across the river and advancing into France. The French High Command initially didn't grasp what had happened. Communications were poor. Radio messages were jammed or intercepted. Telephone lines were cut. Motorcycle couriers got lost or were killed in air attacks. General Gamelin, operating from his headquarters at Vincennes outside Paris, relied on an obsolete civilian telephone system that frequently failed. He wouldn't learn about the breakthrough at Sedan until May 14th. He He wouldn't understand its full implications until May 16th, by which time Guderian's panzers were 55 miles past Sedan and still moving. The French did attempt counterattacks. The 3rd Armoured Division, one of France's best mechanised formations, was ordered to attack the German bridgehead at Sedan. But the orders came too late and were executed too slowly. French tanks were designed for infantry support, not rapid manoeuvre. They moved at 24 kilometers per hour, needed frequent refuelling, and lacked radios for coordination. By the time they arrived, German anti-tank guns were dug in and waiting. The French attack accomplished nothing. The Maginot Line garrisons watched all of this from their fortresses, unable to intervene. Their mission was to hold the German frontier, preventing attacks there. They did so successfully. Not a single German unit attempted to assault the main line. Why would they? The battle was being decided elsewhere. On May 15th, the 1st Maginot Line position fell, but not through assault. Petit Ouvrage La Ferté, a small fort southeast of Sedan, found itself cut off by the German advance. The Wehrmacht surrounded it and subjected it to intense bombardment. 210mm mortars and 88 anti-aircraft guns firing in direct fire mode pounded the fortification for 4 days. The garrison fought back, but the fort was designed to face Germany, not France. Most of its guns couldn't traverse to fire at attackers approaching from the French side. On May 19th, German combat engineers attacked with flamethrowers and explosives. Fire swept through the interior ventilation system. All 107 French soldiers died, most from smoke inhalation. It was the only Maginot Line fort taken by direct assault during the campaign. By May 20th, Guderian reached the English Channel at Abbeville. The Allied armies in Belgium were cut off from the rest of France. The Maginot Line, with its 36 divisions and thousands of fortifications, had become irrelevant. The battle was lost and the forts had barely fired their guns. On May 26th, the British began evacuating from Dunkirk. Over the next week, 338,000 Allied soldiers escaped to England, but they left behind all their heavy equipment. On June 4th, the last British soldiers departed. France stood alone. The second phase of the German offensive began on June 5th. Wehrmacht forces turned south, attacking the remaining French armies. Some assaults targeted the Maginot Line directly, testing whether the fortifications could hold. The answer was yes. On June 14th, the German First Army launched Operation Tiger against the northern sector of the line. Infantry divisions attacked fortifications between Saint-Avold and Saarbrücken. The French defenders repelled every assault. The concrete held against 210mm shells. The turrets functioned as designed. German casualties mounted for no gain. But it didn't matter. Paris fell on June 14th. The French government fled to Bordeaux. On June 17th, Marshal Pétain, now leading the government, requested an armistice. The fighting officially ended on June 25th. The Maginot Line garrisons received orders to surrender on July 1st. Many refused initially. Their fortresses were intact. Their ammunition was plentiful. They had repelled every German attack. Why surrender? But the orders came again. France had capitulated. Further resistance was pointless. Slowly, reluctantly, the garrisons emerged from their fortresses. Fort Schonenburg, which had fired more than 17,000 shells and stopped every German assault, surrendered on July 4th. The garrison marched out under arms, still undefeated. They became prisoners of war nonetheless. The last position to surrender was Fort Michelsberg on the Alpine Line, which held out until July 4th. The Germans were impressed by what they found. The fortifications exceeded their expectations. Some ouvrages became German strongpoints later in the war. Others were stripped of equipment. The concrete shells remained, monuments to a strategy that had failed. The defeat of France shocked the world. 6 weeks. That's how long it took for Germany to conquer a nation that had fought for 4 years in World War I. The Maginot Line, which had cost billions and consumed a decade of effort, had accomplished nothing. Critics were immediate and harsh. The fortifications had created a false sense of security. They had absorbed resources that should have gone to tanks and aircraft. They had encouraged defensive thinking when aggressive offence was needed. The criticisms contained truth, but also distortion. The Maginot Line had succeeded at its intended mission. Not a single German unit breached the fortifications where they were properly constructed. The forts around Metz, Lauter and Alsace held every attack. The problem wasn't that the fortifications failed. The problem was that the battle was fought where no fortifications existed. The fundamental mistake was strategic, not tactical. French planning assumed the next war would be like the last: fixed defences, attrition warfare, slow-moving fronts. The Germans had studied World War I and drawn different conclusions. They developed blitzkrieg, the coordination of armour, air power, and motorised infantry into a fast-moving offensive system. When Germany attacked, they didn't fight the battle France had prepared for. They created a new kind of war. The phrase Maginot mentality entered the language as a warning. It described the tendency to prepare for past threats while ignoring new dangers, to invest in solutions that feel secure but address the wrong problem. The Maginot Line became shorthand for strategic complacency. This characterization was partly unfair. French generals understood the Maginot Line wasn't enough by itself. It was supposed to be part of a broader strategy that included mobile forces. But the broader strategy assumed those mobile forces would fight in Belgium, not defend against breakthroughs in the Ardennes. The failure was in imagination, not engineering. The Maginot Line represented an older way of thinking about war. A war where defenders held ground and attackers had to take it, where concrete and steel could stop armies, where geography mattered more than mobility. Germany proved that all of those assumptions were obsolete. Modern war was about speed, concentration, and psychological shock. The side that moved faster and struck harder would win, regardless of fortifications. Some military historians have argued that the Maginot Line actually contributed to French defeat by absorbing 36 divisions that could have been deployed elsewhere. This argument has merit. Those divisions, equipped with heavy artillery and specialised fortress weapons, couldn't be moved quickly to counter the German breakthrough. They were tied to static positions, but releasing them would have meant leaving the German frontier undefended. Hitler could have exploited that weakness. The Maginot Line created a strategic dilemma with no good solution. The more fundamental problem was French military doctrine. The French army in 1940 was organised and equipped to fight World War I. Tank formations were scattered among infantry divisions rather than concentrated in armoured corps. Radio communication was limited, making coordinated manoeuvre difficult. Officers were trained in methodical, set-piece battles, not fluid operations. Even if the Maginot Line hadn't existed, these problems would have remained. The fortifications didn't cause French defeat. They were a symptom of the same backward-looking thinking that permeated French military planning. After Germany occupied France, they found the Maginot Line's fortifications useful. The concrete was too thick to easily demolish. The positions offered protection from Allied air raids. German forces converted some ouvrages into ammunition dumps and supply depots. Others became defensive strongpoints facing west. In 1944, as Allied forces advanced across France, they occasionally encountered German troops using Maginot Line positions. The Battle of Grostenquin in November 1944 saw American forces attacking Fort Bambesh, a small ouvrage that Germans had fortified. The attack succeeded, but American casualties were significant. Even used in reverse, the fortifications were formidable. After the war ended, the French army reoccupied the Maginot Line. During the Cold War, some positions were modified as potential nuclear bunkers. The thick concrete offered protection against fallout. Communication equipment was updated. Some forts remained garrisoned through the 1960s. But nuclear weapons had made fixed fortifications obsolete just as surely as blitzkrieg had. In 1969, the French military formally abandoned the Maginot Line. Most positions were simply locked and left to decay. Today, the Maginot Line remains scattered across the French countryside like the bones of some enormous creature. The fortifications are still there, though nature is slowly reclaiming them. Moss and lichen cover the concrete. Where shells struck during the war, rust bleeds from exposed steel reinforcement. The gun turrets are frozen in place, hydraulics, long since seized. Most positions are closed to the public, sealed by steel doors or simply too dangerous to enter. Decades of neglect have taken their toll. Tunnels flood during heavy rain. Ceilings crack and collapse. The electric railways are stripped or rusted. But some ouvrages have been preserved as museums. Fort Schonenburg opened to visitors in 1978, maintained by volunteers who spent years restoring the facility. Walking through Schonenburg today provides a glimpse into 1930s military life. The barracks are preserved with bunks in place. The kitchens still have their massive pots. The medical facility displays vintage surgical equipment. The power plant's diesel generators have been restored to operational condition. Visitors can see the underground railway, ride the electric train through tunnels that once echoed with soldiers' footsteps. The observation posts and gun turrets demonstrate how the fortress would have fought. Fort Hackenberg near Thionville offers similar tours. This was one of the largest ouvrages with more than 10 kilometers of tunnels. At peak operation, 1,000 men lived and worked in this single fortress. The tours run on the original electric trains rattling through narrow tunnels. The guides explain how the ventilation system worked, how ammunition was distributed, how the garrison would have responded to attack. The scale is staggering. Room after room carved from solid rock. Ammunition magazines that could hold thousands of shells. Water tanks capable of sustaining 1,000 men for months. It's impossible to walk through these facilities without being impressed by the engineering, and without wondering whether all this concrete accomplished anything. Fort Fourachaux in Lembach has been designated a historic monument. It retains all its original equipment, carefully maintained by a historical society. The hydraulic turrets still function. During demonstrations, visitors can watch as the massive gun raises from its protected position, traverses to a target and retracts. The machinery is 90 years old but still works. The precision of 1930s French engineering is evident in every mechanism. Other fortifications tell darker stories. Petit Ouvrage La Ferté, where 107 French soldiers died in May 1940, has been preserved as a memorial. The damaged turrets remain as they were, testament to the bombardment they endured. Inside, the ventilation ducts still show scorch marks from the fire that killed the garrison. Plaques list the names of the dead. The site is visited primarily by French veterans and families of those who served. Fort Simserhof near Bitchy offers multimedia tours that recreate garrison life. Visitors descend 90 feet underground, into tunnels maintained at a constant 53 degrees. The tour uses projection systems and sound effects to show how soldiers lived and worked. The barracks, mess halls, medical facilities, all preserved or reconstructed. The tour ends with a train ride through the tunnel system, accompanied by recordings describing the experience of living underground for months. The Fortress Museums serve multiple purposes. They preserve history, they honour the soldiers who served in these positions, and they remind visitors of the limits of purely defensive thinking. The fortifications worked as designed. They stopped every German assault. But the battle was fought elsewhere, and technical excellence couldn't compensate for strategic failure. Some positions have found unusual afterlives. Several blockhouses are now mushroom farms. The constant temperature and humidity are ideal for fungus cultivation. Other fortifications have been purchased by private individuals and converted into homes, though living in converted military bunkers requires accepting unusual amenities. No windows, concrete walls 3 feet thick, narrow corridors designed for soldiers, not families. A few have become data centres, the security and climate control proving useful for modern purposes, but most remain abandoned, scattered across the landscape as historical curiosities. The Maginot Line Trail, a 71-kilometre hiking path, connects several fortifications in Alsace. Walkers pass bunkers overgrown with vegetation, gun positions pointing at nothing, entrances sealed with rusted steel doors. The trail is popular with military history enthusiasts and local hikers. It provides access to fortifications that aren't open as museums. From the outside, the scale becomes apparent. Fortresses built into hillsides, their combat blocks positioned for maximum fields of fire. Even in decay, the strategic thinking is visible. The fortifications along the Italian border, the Alpine Line, received less attention historically but remain equally impressive. Built into mountain terrain, these positions use the landscape for defence. Some are accessible only by hiking trails that climb thousands of feet. The Maginot Line at higher elevations faces different challenges. Winter snow covers positions for months. Ice damages concrete as water seeps into cracks and freezes. But the remoteness has preserved some positions that would otherwise have been vandalised or scavenged for materials. The French government still owns most Maginot Line properties. Some are under the control of the Ministry of Defence, which maintains several as storage facilities. Others have been transferred to local municipalities or historical societies. The costs of preservation are substantial. Concrete requires maintenance. Steel doors and hatches need protection from corrosion. Tunnels must be inspected regularly to prevent collapse. Funding is limited, and many positions will eventually become unsafe to enter. Well, the lessons of the Maginot Line extended far beyond France's 1940 defeat. The term Maginot Line entered the military lexicon as a warning against fighting the last war. Staff colleges around the world study the campaign as an example of strategic failure despite tactical success. The fortifications themselves weren't deficient. The thinking that produced them was. The Maginot Line represented the crystallization of World War I lessons. Fortifications work. Defence economises forces. Concrete and steel can stop attacks. All true statements, all insufficient for the war that actually came. The Germans had learned different lessons from the same war. Mobility wins. Concentration of force at decisive points overwhelms static defences. Speed creates opportunities that slow-moving armies cannot exploit. Both sets of lessons were drawn from real experience, but the Germans adapted their doctrine to incorporate new technology. Tanks, aircraft and radios enabled a new kind of warfare. France improved old methods. Germany invented new ones. The Israeli defense establishment studied the Maginot Line extensively after 1948. Israel faced similar challenges: small population, long borders, existential threats. The Bar-Lev Line, built along the Suez Canal after 1967, incorporated some Maginot concepts: fortified positions, interlocking fields of fire, underground facilities. But Israeli planners remembered what had happened in France. The Bar-Lev Line was never intended to stop attacks by itself. It was designed to slow Egyptian forces long enough for Israeli armoured reserves to counterattack. The difference was crucial: static defences as part of a mobile strategy, not as a substitute for one. When Egypt attacked in 1973, the Bar-Lev Line was quickly overrun. But Israeli counterattacks eventually turned the battle. The fortifications had served their purpose, buying time for mobile forces to respond. The lesson was that fortifications could support operations but couldn't win wars alone. The Atlantic Wall, which Germany built along the French coast after 1940, was explicitly compared to the Maginot Line. Hitler ordered massive fortifications to prevent Allied invasion. Concrete bunkers, artillery, positions, obstacles, mines. Some German officers worried they were repeating French mistakes, building static defences while neglecting mobile reserves. Those concerns proved prescient. On D-Day, the Atlantic Wall was breached. Allied forces had learned from 1940. They concentrated overwhelming force at specific points. They used naval gunfire and air power to suppress defences. They maintained momentum, not allowing German forces time to mount coordinated counterattacks. The fortifications inflicted casualties but couldn't stop the invasion. Modern militaries draw several lessons from the Maginot Line experience. First, strategic assumptions matter more than tactical capabilities. Build the best fortifications in the world, but if the enemy doesn't attack where you're strong, those fortifications are irrelevant. Second, flexibility matters more than strength. Mobile forces that can respond to unexpected situations are more valuable than fixed positions, however powerful. Third, technology changes warfare. Yesterday's solutions may be obsolete when tomorrow's war arrives. The Maginot Line was brilliantly designed for 1918. It was inadequate for 1940. The psychological dimension also matters. The Maginot Line created a sense of security that proved illusory. The French public believed they were protected. Politicians could point to the massive fortifications as proof of preparation. This complacency may have delayed necessary military reforms. When the attack finally came, the psychological shock was devastating. France had spent billions on defences. Those defences were bypassed. The entire strategic foundation collapsed in days. This pattern repeats throughout military history. The Great Wall of China didn't prevent conquest. The Siegfried Line didn't save Nazi Germany. The Dien Bien Phu fortifications didn't save French Indochina. Fortifications can buy time, channel attacks, force enemies to concentrate and inflict casualties, but they cannot substitute for sound strategy and operational flexibility. The Maginot Line's legacy in military thought is mostly negative, which is somewhat unfair to the engineers and soldiers who designed and manned it. The fortifications performed as designed. They weren't breached where properly constructed. The failure was in the planning that assumed those fortifications would face the main attack. André Maginot, who died before seeing his project completed or tested in war, was spared the knowledge of its failure. He believed he was securing France against future invasion. He remembered Verdun, the German armies crossing into Lorraine, the destruction that followed. He wanted to prevent that from ever happening again. In a sense, he succeeded. The Maginot Line ensured that if Germany attacked again, the strongest defences would be ready. The tragedy was that Germany didn't attack where France was strongest. 90 years after construction began, the Maginot Line remains visible across eastern France, not as a functional military system, but as a monument to a nation traumatized by war, to engineers who built marvels of defensive architecture, to soldiers who trained for battles that never came, to strategic thinking that was sound in theory but catastrophically inadequate in practice. The fortifications themselves are impressive. Even in decay, even covered in moss and rust, they convey power. Walking through the preserved fortresses, descending into the underground facilities, seeing the machinery that lifted gun turrets and powered electric trains, it's impossible not to marvel at the achievement. France built an underground network comparable to a subway system. They installed ventilation capable of maintaining positive air pressure across kilometres of tunnels. They created self-sufficient fortresses that could house 1,000 men for months. The engineering was first-rate, the strategy was fatally flawed. The lesson isn't that fortifications are useless. It's that preparing for the last war guarantees defeat in the next one. The challenge every military faces is anticipating how warfare will change. Technology evolves, tactics adapt, enemies study your strengths and find your weaknesses. The Maginot Line was designed by men who had lived through World War I. They built something that would have been devastating in 1918. By 1940, warfare had moved on. The question for modern defence planners is whether they're making the same mistake. Are current strategies based on recent wars? Are emerging technologies being ignored? Are assumptions about how enemies will attack being questioned? The Maginot Line suggests that comfortable certainty is dangerous. France was certain Germany would attack through Belgium, certain that the Ardennes was impassable, certain that fortifications would provide time for mobilization. Every certainty proved wrong. The fortresses will outlast the memories of why they were built. Concrete lasts centuries. In another generation, no one alive will remember the Maginot Line as anything but history. Tourists will walk through the tunnels, look at the equipment, read the plaques. They'll be impressed by the engineering. They'll wonder at the scale. And perhaps they'll understand that technical excellence and strategic wisdom are not the same thing. You can build the greatest defences the world has ever seen and still lose the war if you're defending the wrong place. The Maginot Line was supposed to prevent another 1914. It did. Germany didn't invade through Alsace and Lorraine. They didn't attack the fortified sectors head-on. The Maginot Line succeeded perfectly at stopping a war that wasn't coming. France learned that lesson at enormous cost in 1940. The fortresses remain, teaching it still. If this story resonated with you, do me a favour and hit that subscribe button. We dig into forgotten fortresses, abandoned megaprojects, and the colossal engineering, failures that changed history. Every week another story of ambition meeting reality. What other defensive disaster should we explore? Fort Eben-Emael, the Belgian fortress that fell in 20 minutes? Drop your suggestions in the comments, and if you ever find yourself in eastern France, those museum forts are absolutely worth visiting. Fort Schönenberg, Hackenberg, Zimserhof. Walk those tunnels yourself. Stand in rooms where 800 men lived for months without seeing daylight. It hits different when you're actually there. 90 feet underground in a concrete city built for a war that never arrived.